Alright, everybody, back again. It's Communist Cryptid number 2. This is the video where I talk about my own political perspective and the perspective of the channel, at least as it stands at the moment. Give you a preview of some of the kind of analysis and some of the kind of topics I'm going to cover, or attempt to cover, perhaps I should say. I'm going to overview a couple of major thinkers who have been influential on my own life and process. And I'm also going to try and nod towards a few useful texts and useful areas of reference that I hope will be useful not just to people like me who are kind of dedicated leftists and who want to build further in that direction, but also people who are new leftists. I think there's a lot of emphasis on moving people left, quote unquote, on making people leftists in a kind of Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Twitch arena, and I think part of the problem is a lot of leftists don't really have a good sense of what that entails as far as action, and that's what I want to try and detail. What are the consequences of leftism? What are the long-term demands of a leftist political praxis? What are you actually asking for? How do you ask for it? And when do you stop asking for it and start making it happen, which is one of the key things I think we're missing right now. So, I've actually invested a little bit more in my video production here. My previous video, I spent actually a decent amount of time, splicing in images and books and stuff that I think would be useful references. I'll try and do the same thing here. I have a slightly more useful mic setup. So I hope this will indicate a bit of a start towards improving the channel and improving its output. And, let's get started. We're going to do some pretty heavy political discussion today, and I hope you enjoy it. So what am I? I am a Marxist. Excuse me. Marx, I think, is... there's a reason that Marx has actual influence. People like Ludwig von Mises and Murray Rothbard, Milton Friedman. People like, even someone like Burke. Someone who is an actual intellectual pillar of conservative thought, like Burke, or... I was going to say Nietzsche, but only certain conservatives embrace Nietzsche. I mean, only certain conservatives embrace almost anyone you can name, pretty much other than Burke. But there's a reason those people basically stand on their own. They don't have people who write in their tradition outside of that tradition. There are Marxist historians, there are Marxist sociologists, there are Marxist anthropologists, there are any humanities discipline. Most STEM disciplines, there are Marxists. I mean, this isn't a STEM discipline, but one of the more notable Marxists, if you look at, say, YouTube right now, is David Harvey, who's a geographer, whose focus on, planning and kind of geography in terms of the world, the working world, the living and kind of functioning world. That really does inform his scholarship. And all of these people are influenced by Marx. Often they call themselves Marxists. The extent to which that is widespread in academia is vastly overrated. Very few people will, in fact, call themselves Marxists in academia nowadays, especially Marxist. Marx-ish is a kind of somewhat more palatable option to a lot of people. If you're looking for academic Marxists, there simply aren't that many, especially in the English language. There are more in Europe and some in South America. But in the English language, that's a tradition that is definitively on the downhill and perhaps even dead, which is unfortunate. But my point here is that Marx's way of thinking is what is the really notable thing here. It's not necessarily his particular observations, which have come under plenty of, for the most part, quite deserved criticism. I mean, there's a famous kind of example wherein he looked mostly at Manchester, which was this infamously kind of brutish industrial city with standardized factories and time management and a very kind of strict sense of capitalist development insofar as you look at what's happening there, you look at what's happening in capitalism 100 years later, they're pretty close. Like, you look at, Fordist time management, which people were very interested in Manchester factories. You look at other British cities, like places like Birmingham, for example, And there are several kind of notorious, I mean, well-known articles in economic history and in kind of Marxist historiography nowadays that point out that, like, that wasn't the only pattern of development. There are lots of places that are incorporating the kind of famous putting out system, this kind of system wherein people would make products in their home from raw materials that were kind of loaned to them, and then return that to the workplace as part of their essential production. That was way more widespread in certain other cities. The degree to which Manchester represents the whole of capitalism has justifiably come under siege to a certain extent. People don't always take Marx's examples as quite as fully, completely indicative as they used to. And I think that, to an extent, is quite laudable. That is his particular commitments, like when he writes Das Kapital, it is about English 19th century capitalism. That's why it quotes dozens of times from the English factory commissions. That's why it quotes dozens of specific factory owners and factory hands testifying in those commissions. It's very specifically about English capitalism, and the model of English capitalism, of course, was a major developmental model for other capitalism because A, England ruled a lot of the world, and B, the places where it didn't rule, it was competing for rule, such that if it had an economic advantage or an economic institution that you didn't have, often that meant an advantage that you maybe couldn't even counter, and that was a big problem for people like the Portuguese and the Spanish. And I mean, needless to say, the French, the Germans. So there is a sense in which Marx's specific observations have justifiably been challenged. The stuff in Das Kapital and in some of his journalistic output has with considerable justification been challenged. But materialism, and this is the real quintessence of what Marx is originating as a mass theory of analysis. There are precedents, but none that reach Marx's popularity or the clarity of his focus on materialism. None. Materialism means basically that what determines political events is basically material. And it is kind of an implicit contrast. That definition I've given is an implicit contrast to idealism. The idea that ideas, determine the basic facts and the basic progression of political reality. This is a major divide. And you don't always notice it, but realistically speaking, a lot of people are idealists. Anyone who's telling you that politics is about overcoming difference, is about uniting, is about bipartisan, these people are basically idealists. Basically, there are ways in which that can be slightly complicated. But they are basically idealist in the sense that they think what matters is the kind of mental state or mental, balance of some or another particular social group or the social, world at large. If United States politics were less, divided, then we would be better off, or in fact things would be fine. Both of these are idealist. If we were less divided, if you could kind of, if you were the architect in the Matrix, and you could see the values in the program, division is at 90%. I'm just making this up, of course. And you turned it down to 85%, turned it down to 75%, turned it down to 50% or 10%. It would just tick back up because what causes division is material. Material division does not, ideological division does not cause, in the first instance, in almost all cases, ideological division does not cause material division. Material division, material needs, material desires, the satisfaction of material needs. This is the basic precondition of all political organization, because political organization is defined by the social. You can't be a solitary political organism, insofar as if you never meet anybody, you have no politics. You're not agreeing or disagreeing or conflicting with anybody. If you are the kind of hypothetical, What if they put the wandering Jew in North America and he just happened to never meet any indigenous people? You would have no politics. You would literally just be going around satisfying your needs to the extent that you are able to do so. Until you start interacting with other people, and especially forming lasting connections with those people. I mean, there was one of the things people really overestimate nowadays is the degree to which there was contact between Vikings and indigenous people. The Vikings pissed off from North America after their early arrival there quite early. They didn't really stick around in any serious numbers. So there wasn't actually any lasting synthesis, at least lasting synthesis that we could observe by the time of Euro-American contact with Native North American, or American, I should say in general, indigenous people in towards the 14 or 1500s. There is a sense in which, despite the material impact that did have, materialism also forces you to think about consistency and the idea of lasting material influence. Something can be influential but not lastingly influential. Something can be important but not lastingly important. And so Marxism, in my opinion, and I'm giving a fairly broad and a fairly kind of sketch-based introduction to what Marx is about here. One day I would really like to do a video on Das Kapital. I think Das Kapital is a great book, and I've already front-loaded this video with lots of criticisms of the specific things Marx is doing in Das Kapital, and I still think it's a great book. And it's not just a kind of dry economic text. Let me just open up my Dr. Pepper here. It's also an interesting book. It's not a novel, but in some ways it is novelistic. It proceeds from kind of basic events that indicate conflicts. The first 3 chapters, which are infamously very difficult. But if you can get through those first 3 chapters of Das Kapital, you can get through the whole thing, guaranteed. If you can read through those first 3 and understand them, you'll get the whole book, no question. And it's about the way in which Marx thinks, and I've tried to indicate that with materialism. And also another key concept, struggle. The idea that because things are basically material, political things are basically material. They are not basically ideological. They are not conflicts over what people believe or want. They're conflicts over what people do and want and then act in search of. The fact that that is the basic conditions of politics means that agreement, the kind of fullest kind of interpretation of civility, these things are not only, basically impossible, they're actually kind of aberrations. The basic condition of politics is struggle. It is battle between factions who have different political interests and who fight it out in whatever way is available to them. And often those ways are in fact not the same or not even parallel. The poor might be attacking rural landlords while the rich are acting in the Roman Senate. The poor have a limited ability to even have representation in the Roman Senate, let alone, encourage and force lasting progress there. But in their own districts, in the rural world, there they can make real change. That is a different sort of scenario, a different context. And so, when this is something, if you lived through the 2016 election and you were paying attention to it, you'll kind of never forget certain aspects of it, and especially the immediate fallout to the 2016 election, where the last months of Obama and then the early years of the horror show that was Donald Trump, and all this stuff about civility, decorum, the dignity of the president and our institutions. And this also became very prominent following the January 6th attacks, when the crime of Republicans was not decades of horrific and even murderous policy. It was threatening and disrespecting American solidity and American institutions and all their greatness. That was the real threat it wasn't their actual actions and policy. It wasn't George Bush doing the Iraq War or denuding the education system of real federal backbone. It was actually these people kind of insulting and belittling the goodness of American institutions, which anyone with a non-childlike political perception can tell mostly are worthless. This is one of the things you have to accept, and I'll get to my particular conception of this idea later on. But basically, insofar as politics are really struggle, and when you aren't seeing struggle, it's probably because it's been deactivated, not because it's not there. You aren't seeing radical struggle, African American political struggle, national struggle, the struggles of Latino people in the Congress, because it's been forced out of there. To the extent that those things are actually struggled over at all, it's on a local or maybe occasionally state level. These things where despite what you think about any issue, despite what you think about pretty much anything, there is in fact a conflicted consensus that is shifting back and forth imperceptibly, now left, now right, rarely left, but occasionally, that is the real core fulcrum of politics, is that kind of struggle over what is to be. And when you evaluate the left from that perspective, the anti-capitalist left, the part of the North American, and that's where I'm from. I'm not, there are more powerful anti-capitalists in Europe than there are in North America, though I'd argue that they're still ultimately pretty irrelevant. In North America, the left hasn't been relevant for 60, 70 years. If you were writing one of those, those books that are like a short introduction to, and they have the kind of colorful covers, and it's like a short introduction to feminism, a short introduction to post-colonialism, a short introduction to modern physics, a short introduction to, English literature. If you were writing one of those books on modern American political history, modern Canadian political history, not necessarily South American political history, but especially modern 21st century South American political history, you wouldn't include the left. Anti-capitalists, they don't make any impact. Once you get past the 60s and the 70s in North America, they're kind of just a really shouty bunch of nerds who don't really accomplish much of anything. They aren't really a consequential group in terms of, the Christian conservatives are really powerful, the moral majority. They're all these groups. The anti-capitalist left has been irrelevant, both as a demographic within kind of left liberal politics and as its own body enacting struggle for decades. It hasn't done or meant anything, and that is one of the core problems I hope this channel can try to address, is that I think the left is dead. I think it's given up on struggle. I think it's given up the fight. And I think when you read Marx, when you take Marx in, when you start to really understand the degree to which what he's doing is not just saying, hey, 19th century English capitalism, it's pretty no good. He's actually trying to tell you, do analysis like this, think like this. This is what allows you to do concrete political struggle. That's the really valuable area to a certain extent. It's not that there's nothing else that's valuable in Marxism, but the methods and the strategies and the theories, that's what's really the important part, of the works of Karl Marx. Not necessarily, although they are worthwhile and valuable, his characterization of 19th century English capitalism, for which there are a variety of valid and relevant criticism. But when you look at materialism, when you look at the political framework of struggle, that is immeasurably valuable. Excuse me. I'm just going to take one pause in my recording here. Well, I'm not going to take one pause. There's going to be several pauses. But I'm just going to pause in my recording here so I can take a look at my notes. I'll be right back. Another really important part of Marxist analysis is the idea of value. This is where the famous Coates and Lenin and exchange and these examples that people sometimes kind of get a little bit frustrated by, not without reason. The value Marx is talking about, and this is another important point that I think gets overlooked, and this is something especially the new materialists, this kind of especially philosophically oriented school of Marx, not necessarily Marxist thinkers, but people influenced by Marx and who want to present a fuller vision of materialism as an analytical tool in philosophy. The creation of value as a specific form of economic data is in fact a really important part of capitalism. The idea of value and value leading to profit, and thus that value is totally divorced from anything non-numerical in economic calculations, which covers everything from externalities to, the kind of, well, yeah, sure, I mean, the death squads employed by Coca-Cola might hit their balance sheets, but the consultants towards the Chilean government probably won't. Those will probably still be paid for by the government. That's a certain kind of extra cost that isn't always absorbed by the market entity itself. But the short answer is that the creation of value, this kind of tool of finance and the market, these are really important in people's lives. That is how medieval peasants get things other than food. I mean, most medieval peasants grow food or grow subsistence crops of some kind or another, and then to get other things they need to engage in trade. And so ANCAPs are quite right when they say that trade has been going on for a long time. But they're very wrong when ANCAPs insist that capitalism has been going on for a long time, because capitalism is a specific mode of organization and exchange. It is not all of human history we've done this. It is a specific and a developed mode of organization and exchange. And you can tell because it doesn't happen at scale before those preconditions are met. One of the more famous examples of this kind of error in thinking, and this is something that really gets my goat, is the tragedy of the commons. This was an actual article written by, I don't recall the guy and I don't recall the journal, which is kind of silly of me, but, as it is. And he wrote an article, I think it was an economics journal, about how, okay, so you're a medieval peasant. You all have this collectively owned land. You have this collectively owned pasture, for example, where your feed animals or your draft animals get their food. The best thing for you to do is use it to the point of exhaustion. From a self-interest perspective, it's really clear what you ought to be doing. That is, exhausting this resource, using it to the point that it can't be used any further. And he makes the point, which in his scenario is quite valid, that, well, if that's your incentive, that is in fact everyone's incentive, or at least the incentive of everyone in a similar position. And thus, everyone will be exhausting the land. The problem is, and if you think about this for 10 seconds, you should see it, that's applying capitalist market dynamics where, well, he's not legally breaking the law, but no one likes what he's doing. He's overburdening the land, and people can see that. But in a capitalist system, well, what you do is say, well, you'd throw up your hands and say, well, it's legal. Like, what am I going to do? I'm going to go stop him? How? I can't take him to court. That's the only way you really stop people when it comes to the administration of their personal property. Under feudalism, if you were a peasant who was overgrazing his cattle, your neighbors would just come by and beat the shit out of you. Like that's the capitalist market dynamic of, I need to find a court. What is the precise legal delineation of my rights to the property in question and to my own private property, the employment of my own private property? Those don't matter in feudalism. It is a social order where the kind of private property questions that are at the center of capitalism are not at the center. They aren't totally irrelevant. There is questions of property and private property, and even kind of alienable labor and alienable private property in the 1200s, in the 1400s, in a distinctly medieval pre-capitalist time period. But they aren't the majority consideration of society. These are things that are essentially, in the cracks, and they grow to become the big thing. They do not start as the big thing. And so in a sense, you have to consider that alienated value, this kind of value that is divorced from all social functions, where value is purely and only the economic calculation of profit and of return. That is a specific formation of capitalism, and I'd like to talk later on about, I had his name and don't know where I put my note. There's a book on new materialism that is quite good on these issues, and I can't remember the guy's name, but I'll find it sooner or later. But so I've talked a little bit more about Marxism here. I'm just going to take a quick little break. But Marx is really good. There's a reason that people are so inclined towards him, and it's because he's really, really perceptive. And perceptiveness doesn't sound like it's that big of a compliment. But it really is, because he perceived things way in advance of what other people at his time were perceiving. He was not the only guy writing on economics. He was not the only guy writing on what we now call political science. He was the only guy, though, who made observations that were that powerful and that lasting and that definitive. So let me just take one break, and then we'll talk about another person who was definitive, Lenin. Alright, let's get back into it here. Why is Lenin someone to learn from? I mean, I'm a Canadian. In the Western canon, Lenin at best is kind of a political mastermind, but a sinister, genius at the same time. Lenin, like many revolutionaries of his era, was also a writer on revolutionary theory and on practice. And I think in general, it's very hard to negotiate the modern world as a Marxist without eventually bumping up against Lenin, because he writes on phenomena that are defining the beginning of the 20th century and phenomenon that will continue to dominate a lot of the 20th and indeed the 21st centuries. Most specifically, I'm talking here about imperialism, which we'll talk about in a second. But in general, Lenin's a really strong writer on kind of what socialists should be thinking about, doing analysis of socialism and its prospects in especially Russia, his home country, where he had been, in fact, for much of his career exiled from. So there's a variety of ways in which he's really a laudable analyst of a variety of phenomena, and especially modern imperialism. Lenin is from the backwater, comparatively speaking, when it comes to imperialism of Russia. But this is somewhat deceptive. People don't really think of Russia as a massively significant imperialist power, and it certainly wasn't the foremost, but it had a lot of imperial power within Central Asia. It had a ton of power over areas kind of threatening India, which would cause conflict with Britain for decades to come, at least at the time when those areas were first established. Such that Russia was an imperialist power, but it clearly wasn't the defining imperialist power. So Lenin's theories on imperialism and imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, are very important and actually very subtle and very nuanced, in my opinion. It doesn't just say, and you do occasionally get this from certain analysts, that actually there's one imperialist power and you're either with that imperialist power or against them. That's actually not what it says. It says that the one imperialist power, the leading imperialist power, shatters the previous world order, such that sooner or later there is nothing arrayed against it except opponents or allies to a certain extent. Like, everyone has to be an imperialist bloc, although that does not then mean that every imperialist bloc, other than the leading bloc, is counter to that particular one. So there's an important way in which Lenin grows up in imperialism, in an imperialism that is not as fully defined as Britain's, but is a very significant element of Russian statecraft and state policy and state advancement. I mean, for a long time, the advances into Central Asia are I shouldn't say replaced, but they are what eventually a lot of that energy will be diverted instead to Russian industrialization. A lot of the energy that is into colonizing areas of what we now call Iran, for example, is eventually going to be redirected towards Russia's own industrialization, such that this is kind of an important area of Russia and the state and its priorities, even though it is a smaller area in prominence overall, and even within the state, than the, say, French or British empires. So, Lenin was an excellent analyst, and he was able to look at imperialism and see the ways in which it was forcing all powers to react to it, not those directly in conflict with it, not those directly aligned with it. All powers had to have a reaction to imperialism, not necessarily just pro or against, but they all had to do something to respond to this world defining, world reshaping power that he was in a prime position, as was Marx. I mean, Marx was not a huge writer on colonialism. He didn't accord it a tremendous amount of place in really any of the 3 volumes of Capital. I mean, Primitive Accumulation has some of that, and it isn't unimportant, but it isn't his main focus. And Lenin, he's not about colonialism. He's not necessarily about economic imperialism. He's kind of about strategic imperialism, the way in which imperialism forces powers to be aligned with or against one another, and forces them to conform to the strictures of those alignments, even as they also grind against them. So there's a variety of ways there in which Lenin is a really significant figure. Another one, and this is the one where, if you're a person who believes in, tankies or red fash or whatever, this is the part where you can leave, I suppose. In that Lenin and the Russian Communist Party proved the value of discipline and of disciplined methods of struggle. And in stuff like left-wing communism and infantile disorder, he does an admirable job of showing that, to do this kind of real political change that you publicly profess to want, you will openly say this is what you want to do. Well, all the examples of people doing this, if you look back in time, are of people acting under discipline. The Russians, the Chinese, the Vietnamese, the Cubans. All of these people are acting under party structures and discipline. And he has the very accurate point that anarchists struggle to advance coherent objectives because they simply can't force and maintain coherent action. I'm reading between the lines a little bit here. He doesn't put it in so many words. But this is a really important part and a really important component. I'll talk about anarchism a little bit later on because I was, in fact, kind of a left-wing anarchist for a while. I was a right-wing anarchist in ANCAP in my youth, and then I was a real anarchist, a left-wing anarchist later on. And I read a lot about the CNTFII and Makhno, and the Rojava experiment, and the Zapatistas, and all sorts of groups, such that I actually do know a fair amount about anarchism and anarchist experiments and this sort of thing. I can speak with a certain amount of authority. And mostly I'm critical of them. I think tankies, like me, frankly, can sometimes get a little bit over-enthusiastic about criticizing these projects. Frankly, anarchist Catalonia was rife with contradiction. For one thing, people vastly overstate the rural developmental aspects, which were minimal. It was mostly an urban project, although there were anarchist strongholds in the rural areas. The real energy in anarchist Catalonia was in Barcelona, pretty much exclusively, honestly. And so there is a question one should pose about the CNT FII is, how successful were they long term? Were they really as powerful as we sometimes think they were? Well, in some ways, no, is the answer. But who also weren't quite as powerful as we sometimes say they were? The fucking Bolsheviks, the USSR. These are systems that, anarchists don't do quite as well. There's a reason why I'm a Marxist and not an anarchist in principle. But there is a sense in which, if you're someone who's willing to appreciate the contradictions and the challenges and the failures, frankly, of the USSR and of China and of Cuba and of, you should be able to appreciate, at least in principle, the successes and failures of anarchist Catalonia and the Makhnovist Free Territory in Ukraine, and a variety of other projects, which are important, even though they don't quite beat, the record, frankly, that I think tankies have established in a real sense. So I think that's important. I'm going to take one little pause here before I finish my segment on Lenin here, but I'll just leave you with the following notion. What is American left-wing politics missing? And discipline is a key component. no one really acts in solidarity. Isn't actually true. Lots of people act in solidarity. No one really acts coherently in alliance, in strategic ways with other people. What we need to be looking at is not merely doing things that are good, but doing things that advance a plan, a strategy. And Lenin, as someone who actually had to manage and be part of a real revolution, actually really started to get this. Unequal development is not a concept developed solely by Lenin by any means, but especially as he moves into his own the last years of his life essentially, and he is trying to industrialize the USSR in a process that's proves extremely frustrating. Unequal development and the idea of development being itself a struggle, a conflict, a challenge is another really important aspect of the Leninist legacy. And one more I'll note is encirclement. This is kind of post Lenin's death to a certain extent. The USSR was being encircled even while Lenin was still alive, and even while the project was young. I'm Canadian, and there are several Canadian military regiments who had, after the First World War, their first non-First World War engagements were against the Bolsheviks in Russia, and part of the Russian Civil War. Some artillery regiments, if I remember correctly. And so, you should kind of think of Lenin as someone who was where we were in the sense of a very challenging situation with no clear answers, but who did what we didn't do so far and developed answers, developed a movement, developed a popular movement that could carry his political objectives to fruition. And that's one of the key things we're absolutely not doing right now. So let me take a quick break. I'm kind of finished with my Lenin segment. Talk about Mao next, and then we'll talk about some of my personal influences. Okay, so Chairman Mao Zedong. I mean, I've talked about the ways in which Lenin shows us that we ought to be acting, with discipline, that we ought to be acting in ways that comprehend the kind of global strategic implications and positions that we are placed in by events often beyond our control. What Mao shows us, and especially I'm interested in his theories on contradiction. He wrote on contradiction, on the correct handling of contradictions among the people, a few others. And I think he pushes really useful notions, and one of the distinctive things about Mao is that he's a long-term successful military and strategic leader. The Communist Party of China right now, nowadays, has the following line on Mao, that he was 7/10 good and 3/10 bad, which honestly, as far as breakdowns goes, pretty good. I mean, yeah, the cult of personality was a bad development. The Cultural Revolution, bad plan. Like, he did a bunch of stuff that was pretty clearly and undeniably stupid and bad. But he also led the party through the anti-Japanese war and through the war with Chiang Kai-shek into the victory of the Communist Party. And his early years, especially the 50s, are marked by a lot of really innovative programs and interesting strategies, and he's a very interesting thinker and man. And I mean, yeah, it's true. Like, in his later years, frankly, Chairman Mao became deluded on a number of subjects, and frankly, there aren't that many people in China who would fight with you on that notion. There was a controversy a couple years ago where a kind of independently rich guy who was a big kind of Chinese patriot put up a big statue of Mao, and the party came and took it down and said, no, we don't do that with Mao anymore. I mean, we get it, you like him, but it's gold statues for the guy are over. It's done. So, the Chinese do not necessarily have an uncritical attitude towards Mao, nor do tankies, although people often assume we do. But it's worth noting, over a long record of service, he has a pretty extraordinary set of achievements. He makes mostly correct predictions regarding the anti-Japanese war, mostly correct predictions regarding the Chinese Civil War. He pioneers the base area Xi'an movement. He's genuinely a really powerful thinker and activist and planner of the Chinese Revolution. So, what do contradictions show us? Foreign Language Press, or Languages Press, is a great little independent left-wing publisher, does lots of translations, lots of things in multiple languages. Great. And they have a really good edition of Mao Zedong's On Contradiction, which I don't know if this is necessarily included in other editions. I have a tendency to think it would be. But to illustrate the meaning of the term contradiction in Chinese specifically, use the following example. There's a salesman essentially who is selling weapons and armor, and he's selling a spear and a shield, and he says, "This is the greatest spear that's ever been made. It'll shatter any this is the greatest spear that's ever made. It'll shatter any shield and break through any obstacle." And then he holds up the shield and says, "This is the greatest shield ever made. It'll resist any weapon and hold you against the most, dangerous of enemies." And this is a contradiction. You've got both going on at once, it's not necessarily about, fire ice, which is, a thing that can't exist other than in some kind of physics or chemist scenario. You can't have ice that's on fire, or you can't have these things that, occupy kind of opposing fundamental natures. There's a very broad way of saying it, but you know what I mean. Contradiction is not necessarily about that. It's about things that are lastingly incoherent with each other. It's about contradictions within society and within capitalism, not about, physics or chemistry contradictions or whatever that I mean. And I don't know, frankly, that's not my background. But this is a really useful way to think of things. Contradictions are all around us. Look at the conflict in Ukraine. A lot of leftists have a really stupid line on this, which is that America shouldn't be involved, who cares? Well, that's dumb. I mean, America's obviously going to get involved. They're the leading imperialist power in the world. There's no actual scenario where America exists as it does today, and it has no opinion on the invasion of a sovereign state that had attempted to join NATO. That is, to respond to issues like that is why NATO exists. But at the same time, the imperative strategically for Russia, for generations, for literally hundreds of years, has been guarding the frontiers of that massive polity, especially in Eastern Europe, by guarding the Western approaches with compliant states, especially states that will resist Poland and Germany and France. These are long-term strategic enemies of the Austrians as well, of the Russians. And it's still in play. Russia will not tolerate EU or NATO or really any of it, states that are fully integrated with any of those systems on their borders or sufficiently close to their borders. And it's not a matter of what's right or wrong. It's a matter of what they perceive and how they'll act. It's a matter of nothing you can do as far as being an American imperialist can change the fundamental strategic imperative of the nation of Russia as it is currently constituted, which is secure the western frontiers, especially by compliant, aligned, or dominated states in Eastern Europe. Fact. So, where does that leave us, then? Russia's always going to want to resist Ukraine joining EU, NATO, etc., etc. They will always have an interest in Donetsk and Luhansk, not necessarily because they're ideologically committed to overseas, but non-domestic Russians, but because the non-domestic Russian population in those cities, which is mostly like poor laborers, it's not like an upper class for the most part, that gives them an entry point to these areas where it has a long-term strategic goal of changing conditions to reassure their own strategic needs. America can do nothing with all its power to change that fundamental alignment. There are only really two things that can happen in the kind of Russian intervention by America. And I don't mean boots on the ground, I just mean if America pushes Russia further, Putin is gone. Putin is replaced. Who's he going to be replaced by? There's no one with political following in Russia other than oligarchs who have their own kind of personal loyal followings, and a certain number of mostly Western, mostly city-based kind of liberal types who frankly do not have that big of a following. They just don't. The only person you'll ever replace Putin with is just another Putin. Just like Yeltsin did this stuff in Chechnya, so did Putin after he succeeded him. And Putin was known to be one of Yeltsin's leading lieutenants. Nobody in the West, the power that re-engineered Russia following the fall of the USSR, nobody in the West was blindsided by Putin taking, this vicious nationalist. No, Putin acts entirely within the realm of traditional Russian state objectives and institutional objectives of the Russian state in general. The only person you could replace him with is another guy exactly like him. There's no one in Russia who is acceptable to the West who will give up Donetsk and Luhansk unless you get the worst neoliberal. You get someone kind of like Yeltsin, just like a spineless drunk who won't really even do anything or resist in any significant way. Someone who will just acquiesce. And in that case, yeah, maybe they would give up Donetsk and Luhansk. But once you leave, once American political priorities change and looks at watch, approximately 20 minutes, and the next guy comes along who's just another Putin, where are you then? Just where you were when Yeltsin left. The greater problem here is twofold. One, the emotional investment of leftists and Americans. People who will complain and scream even about world fascism and world tyranny while living in the core of both of those concepts, living in the nation that advances those concepts more than absolutely anyone. America is worse than Russia because America has the capacity to do more than Russia in an evil manner, and it does. It does Ukraine stuff. You just don't hear about it because you read American media. The Ukraine crisis illustrates the centrality of contradiction to useful left-wing analysis. The contradiction is the basic imperative and, even simple desire of the EU and NATO to expand eastwards to as close to Russia as possible, especially having basically inherited an anti-Russian mission from the falling apart of the USSR. And Russia will always resist it having, enemy states directly on its border. The only thing that can change is something that would cause so many other further changes that it would, renegotiate the basic terms. Right now, all we're doing in the Ukraine, Canada, America, is supplying weapons that are allowing this particular form of the conflict to go decisively in Ukraine's favor. Again, when our political priorities change, like they did in Afghanistan, remember that? A couple months ago, it wasn't all that long ago. Like, when our political priorities change, and the Russians march into Kiev, and hey, they left a Russian Gay Straight Student Alliance membership list on the board. That's lucky for us. Like, that's what's going to happen, and you have no way, as an American citizen, as a Canadian citizen, as someone who supports Ukraine, as someone who doesn't support Ukraine, you have no way to intervene. You have no way to affect this in any way. You are a nothing. This is purely a NatSec rollout of the usual suspects, of the usual methods of attempting to return recalcitrant states to compliance with U.S. empire. That's it. You have nothing to say of value. Putting the flag in your Twitter, do I have to describe to you how useless that is? Come on. Contradiction is what defines our political world. And the contradiction right now is the fact that China is central to the world economy, but also the state most likely to lastingly disrupt it. And when that contradiction comes to the fore and explodes, American political dominance is done. Is done. I think people are very optimistic about the degree to which the U.S. can engage in a prolonged political struggle with China. I don't think you can really seriously put the two countries together. America has a vastly disunited and divided population. China, for all its faults, has a powerful economy, a powerful population, a well-educated population. The stuff that won World War II is all in China's favor. I'm not saying that's the only thing that matters, but intelligence, advanced logistics and planning, all of these things are really with China. And I'm sorry, who's more similar to Russia? It's not China, it's America. They're the major country that spent the last 20 years fighting nothing but comparatively disorganized insurgents who can score victories over them, but will always be routed in individual firefights, of course. Well, do you think it's going to be any different when American carriers and frigates try and approach China? And basically the same thing that happened to Russian tanks happens to your fleet, where advanced kind of modern countermeasures just punch through your countermeasures, or manage to do enough damage to significantly impair your plans, at least. And this is what Mao is about. Mao is someone who understood the chess game of world politics, and it's not really a chess game because it's asymmetric and there's fog of war and there's a million things in which it is not like chess, but it is about struggle and battle and competition, and not just economic competition where you have to fight the other person and beat them. It is an actual fight in a certain sense. And this is, in my reading, in my opinion, what Mao brings. And another thing that's important about Mao and about the Chinese example of socialism is socialist development is not uniform. I am a respecter of socialism with Chinese characteristics. And frankly, I respect it because no one's ever developed socialism with American characteristics. So if it's a superior model, well, get around to making it, and then you can make a decent argument, The Chinese socialism with Chinese characteristics model has brought literally millions out of poverty while maintaining some difference from pure capitalist integration. I'm sorry, if China was purely integrated into the capitalist world economy, why does every other player in the world economy seem to fucking hate them so much? You know what I mean? So you have to respect that the Communist Party of China, socialism with Chinese characteristics, socialist development in one country, these are ideas and concepts and realities that you have to accept as simply factual, especially if you live in another country where you've never accomplished. I mean, what could you say? I mean, has the American left accomplished something 1/1000th as big as the building of the base areas after the Long March? Not even close. You'd be delusional to think they had. Mao was a really important figure, and I encourage you to look into Mao and the writings of Mao and Stalin and Lenin and a variety of other people who are often discounted by certain strands of Western Marxism and modern Western left-wing activism. I'm going to come back and talk about some of my personal influences, and then maybe we'll call it a day. Back in just one moment. Alright, well, let's talk a little bit about anarchism. I spent some time studying anarchism, and I had a special interest in the Spanish Civil War. And before I get on to some of my kind of personal influences, Jay Sakai, Silvia Federici, Frantz Fanon, Clausewitz, settler colonialism is an idea in academic history that I'm very influenced by. I'll talk a little bit about my experiences with anarchism. And I found the problem with it to be simply that it lacked a way to do full systematic analysis and to put that analysis in terms of advancing struggle. It struggled to see the ways in which conflicts and contests were interlinked and were in fact dependent on local factors rather than, it really annoys me personally when anarchists get into statism and the idea of actually basically all states are the same, and if you like a state that basically means you're illegitimate, and like the sense of states being the real common item of criticism here. I think that's really, really crude and reductive. I mean, there are ways in which the Mohawk people had a state. There are ways in which they had a state. But it would be utterly foolish and silly and naive to talk about that state as having essentially the same bounds and problems as the European state. They're fundamentally different in a number of ways. And this lack of analysis shows up in the fact that a lot of anarchists in times of conflict kind of act in kind of silly ways. I think a lot of the stuff about Makino is exaggerated. I think it really overplays the degree to which, yeah, he was a respected leader amongst the Ukrainian Black Army. The Black Army wasn't an anarchist army. The black flag wasn't the black anarchist flag. It was the black flag of peasant proprietarianism, as had been the symbol for centuries. It wasn't about Makino teaching the peasants how to do revolution, to do anarchism. It was about Makino being one of many peasant leaders who happened to himself enunciate an anarchist philosophy, but despite his influence, which was considerable, he never made the rest of the army anarchist. He never sought to do so. And in general, the fact that he was defeated, indicates that method of organization was not ultimately triumphant. He was defeated by conventionally organized Soviet forces, Red Army forces. And so you have to accept that Makino is not this person who was building the alternative world and the cruel Soviets snuffed him out. No, he already, just like anyone else, his system was already riven with contradictions, full of failings and problems. And when it failed to stand up to even the not particularly intensive pressure that the Soviets applied to it, they could have applied a lot more pressure to it. Well, then that's the point at which you have to kind of stop caring about it. And a lot of Russian anarchists had condemned Makino because the Russian anarchists were starting to become dominated by just people who were criminals, basically. People who had been part of the prison escapes or prison breakouts or prison closures, and who would then commit kind of personal and petty crimes, robberies and assaults and rapes and stuff like this. And then simply say, well, we were anarchists, we were political. Actually, it's part of our praxis. And this is an actual thing. You can see it in the minutes of certain Russian anarchist meetings, where people will say, well, look, this is a big problem. This is destroying our reputation. It's making us seem like fools. Nobody wants to follow us. And other anarchists will simply say, this is how people are choosing to act. This is what they're choosing to do spontaneously. And I don't even mean that to say, oh, they're making kind of lame moralist excuses. No, they genuinely thought that kind of thing was practical and tangible political struggle in a way that, looking back, is obviously ridiculous. This, too, is the problem with the Spanish Civil War. Excuse me. People will act, and people will tell you that actually Catalonia was way more notable and powerful and significant than the USSR or China or Vietnam. And then it was destroyed, perhaps because it was such a big threat, by the communist and Bolshevik-linked Socialist Party and Communist Party of Spain in the May days, in 1937, when the anarchist sections of Barcelona are fought over with communists and socialists, who are eventually victorious. And the problem with this narrative is the anarchists are doing a really bad job of fighting the revolution. And the reason the communists sought to alienate them is because they wanted their resources, but not the crap that came with dealing with them, The anarchists did not take Barcelona. They were basically given it because it was far away from the front line. That was where their stronghold was already. And the government needed to concentrate on Madrid and the kind of central portions of Spain where the conflict was about to occur. And so the anarchist experiments in Catalonia, though interesting, in the end, they don't actually represent this huge seizure of power, this kind of independent creation of a new world. They're in the context of a larger revolution that is not solely defined by anarchism, and they're able to define this region by anarchism pretty much only because other people have deliberately abandoned it. And then when it comes to actual conflict and competition with the fascists, for example, or with even the Spanish right wing and the nationalists, the anarchists have an abysmal combat record, and this is kind of the worst thing you can say about them, in my opinion. If their ideas about elected officers and kind of democratic units and fighting men who came together under kind of anarchist principles were worth anything, they would have won fights, and they constantly lost over and over. Excuse me. They lose before the war, they lose during the war, they lose after the war. All of these anarchist methods of struggle are compelling if you don't actually look at their results, and exclusively then, and this isn't me being a dick, but to the extent that the YPG and the Kurds and the Zapatistas to the extent that they engage in certain elements of anarchist practice, they'll often say quite deliberately, no, we're not anarchists. There is, in fact, a very famous publication by these Zapatistas under the title, Why We Are Not Anarchists. And it's because they're doing active experimentation. They aren't dictated to by the kind of big list of anarchist moral commandments that incline you towards democratic combat units, even when it's proven that that is a terrible way to organize combat units. These groups that actually do this in the real world are inclined towards spontaneity and experimentation in a way that, there are credible ways to link that to anarchism. But the reason I'm no longer an anarchist is because, simply put, I think a lot of anarchism offers nothing. I think it doesn't offer anything to people. I think it fails to really give them a way to do struggle, to advance struggle, to fight in the struggle, to really make that decisive. And I think that's a big problem. So that's just a kind of quick word on anarchism. I'm going to go over a couple of the influences I listed a few minutes ago here. One more break, and then we'll finish her up. Okay, so quick decision time. I'm actually going to slightly change plans here and make this the end of the episode. I've talked for just about an hour about Marx, Lenin, and Mao, and my own political perspective, and a lot of topics and digression, and I'm actually going to save my discussion of my own personal influences, for the next video, which will be Cryptid number 3. So, signing off once again, all the best, have a great day. Communist Cryptid, signing off.